Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We had a bit of a technical difficulty last week with the recording, so we are re-recording the first 4 slides of our Wakefield Research presentation. To get everybody caught up, we have 3 participants today. We have myself, Matt Palak-Derry, who is our Chief Strategy and Revenue Officer at Tealbook. We have Nathan Richter, who is a Senior Research Partner at Wakefield Research, a leading independent provider of quantitative, qualitative, and hybrid marketing research and marketing intelligence. Wakefield Research supports the world's most prominent brands and agencies, including 50 of the top Fortune 100 in 90 countries. Wakefield's work is regularly cited by media influencers, including NPR, The Washington Post, Fortune, Fox News, Psychology Today, Forbes, NBC, and others. To learn more about Wakefield Research, go to wakefieldresearch.com. And last but not least, you will hear from Kate Hands, our VP of Customer Success, who has led large-scale digital transformations globally with some of the largest brands, including Amex, L'Oreal, and others. So the first part of our research that we will cite today is a cause for concern. Around 3 in 4 procurement leaders are concerned their supplier intelligence has not significantly improved since the start of COVID-19. And this is really impactful because nearly all of our respondents, 96% of them, agree that being agile is now more important than cost savings to the company's bottom line. And this is a paramount shift in the reasoning of procurement, because to date, what we have seen is procurement really being valued by the cost savings they can deliver to the bottom line. And what we're really seeing now is that through the pandemic, through supply chains being disrupted, that there's been more and more of a pressing issue on just keeping the business running. Some of the core activities that were seen as non-strategic before, such as indirect procurement, were really strategic things during COVID-19. For example, finding PPE to keep factories open, that was never something that you would have considered needing to shut down your business to address. And last year we saw businesses shut down entirely because they could not keep their employees safe. And by doing so, it made so much larger of a revenue impact because they could not meet supply demands that were going on globally. On the next slide here, we see that some of the top concerns when citing the effects of poor supplier data is actually missing out on supplier innovation. And missing out on supplier innovation was our top concern, and it was cited by over 30% of our respondents as their #1 concern. But when we look at how many actually responded in this manner in general, is that 92% of all of our respondents cited missing out on supplier innovation in one way or another, and 74% are actually extremely concerned that they're not in a position to be able to leverage this information. What may have been one of the most interesting findings is that when we talk about systemic supplier data failures, 91% of the respondents actually cited multiple top concerns. So we mentioned the top one being supplier innovations at 30%, but 29% actually responded that it was compromising the integrity of their IT solutions, and 26% cited that they were falling behind their competition due to poor data. And so Kate, we'll turn it back over to you. You encounter this every day. Are there some that particularly jump out to you here?
Yeah, and before going on to that, Matt, I'll actually just touch on a point that I think is important before we look at the concerns. That's that procurement teams have historically looked at spend data as the kind of primary data when it comes to suppliers, and that limits them only to kind of short to medium term savings as an ROI. And now they've realized that it's only when they make supplier data the organizing principle that they can actually achieve, agility, enable value-added procurement, such as all of these concerns that we're seeing here, because those bring with them sustainable cost savings, but also that top-line impact that is so becoming more and more important. And so I've touched already on a couple of these, but things like having a less efficient and effective company. So what we're seeing is, and I'm sure every company sees this, but our customers were saying, new vendors were being added on when existing vendors already existed who could help with that. And then you're paying onboarding costs, you're increasing your time to market. It's got a whole lot of knock-on effects. Or, trying to use antiquated methods to discover suppliers. Our supply discovery functionality is like 95% or 90% faster than traditional methods. And we're giving our customers, that quick access to accurate supply information, which is invaluable when you need to make quick decisions and get that information in front of the right people and become that trusted advisor. And then I guess with regards to, partnering with untrustworthy vendors, we had the UK government engage with us last year to identify PPE manufacturers. And without having, information on product level certifications when you're buying something as critical as PPE, it's very difficult to make rapid fire decisions on which manufacturers you should engage with, and give you that comfort level. I think we gave them 60,000, they were able to whittle it down to 200 with those kind of pre-qualified criteria, in order to get in front of the right vendors. So giving you that layer of assurance before you're engaging with a vendor is kind of critical as well.
Yeah, certainly. And I think there was no shortage of fraud happening last year. Certainly you had many organizations that shifted production lines and tried to do the right thing. But equally, there were just as many bad actors in the space that were trying to take advantage. So
exactly right.
Certainly something we saw a lot of. But on the cost side of it brings us to the next part of our presentation where we found that there was a pretty high cost associated with supplier records. And so, Nathan, I'll turn it back over to you. We touched on this a little bit last week. Can you remind the audience what goes into the cost finding here?
Absolutely. So when we ask procurement leaders about their records cost, we're not asking them to do sort of the math longhand or perform an official multivariable time and labor analysis. This is an opinion survey. And so what we're trying to learn is what's the scale of this cost? What's the scale of this investment? Thinking of all that's required to manage supplier information, what do you think it costs? And then we're left to assess on the research side and on the Tealbook side and ultimately your audience, is that figure a lot? Is it a little? What is it? And we learned that procurement leaders estimate the annual cost per supplier record to be just north of $2,400, $2,431 to be exact. And so, what we take away from that as researchers, and what your audience should take away is that this reflects that our procurement leaders recognize the significant cost and effort going into every single record that they manage and that they're responsible for.
And so, Kate, I want to turn it over to you. Are you seeing this in the current customer base? And certainly, do you think that this is as widespread of a problem as certainly the research shows?
Yeah, I do, Matt. And I think even probably with our existing customers, they probably wouldn't have known the historic cost of maintaining these records prior to Tealbook. Naturally, through our autonomous enrichment, we reduce that down substantially. But it's not just the cost associated with maintaining those records that's alarming, because that by its nature, I was quite surprised by how high that was. But it's also the opportunity loss of not having good supply data. We've touched on all the benefits that it unlocks once you've got that. And I think people look at that cost, and yeah, if you multiply that across 30,000 suppliers, we're talking millions and millions of dollars. But what they're neglecting to look at is what is the top line growth and bottom line impact we can have by having this good supply data. So it's more than just that $2,400. It's when you start layering that in, it's much higher per supply record.
Yeah, and actually, when we overlay this study with a study we did last year, we found that last year, over 50% of the respondents reported having over 10,000 suppliers. And so what we're saying here is that over 50% of the base that the cost to their organization is in the realm of $24 million when you consider the opportunity costs. So Nathan, I want to turn it back over to you. Is that what the research is saying? And do you have any additional insights you can give us when layering the study from last year on top of this year?
Yeah, I mean, I would approach that the same way that we approach the former metric, which is giving you a size of scope and scale. There is certainly work that can be done on the organizational level that can give a company the exact cost. But you almost don't need to do that when you have research like this. It's telling you that there's a significant cost per record, and you can assume that that is multiplied across all of your records. And so it's an appropriate analysis to do for understanding, is this a big problem or a little problem? And it sounds like in the world of procurement that this is a significant problem.
And so, Kate, I'll turn it back over to you. You mentioned that many of our clients you didn't anticipate them having a way to calculate it. 33% of the respondents here admitted that they had no idea how to calculate this number. In previous roles that you've been in, have you ever been able to calculate this number, and how have you thought about it?
Yeah, it's a really challenging one to get your arms around, Matt, and it varies from organization to organization. I think, in the large global organizations that I've worked in, it would be almost impossible because, you've got, I mentioned earlier that supply data, it's not only your existing technology stack in your territory, but it's also if you layer that across multiple countries, I probably imagine it's much higher than that. So, but what I find interesting from the Wakefield research is that those who are more likely to, those that said that their supply data during the pandemic was inadequate, correlated to those who didn't know the costs, and those who had more insight into the costs actually had more confidence in their data. So it just shows the importance of kind of mapping out your technologies, mapping out where supply data could reside and should reside, but then bringing that all together to a holistic kind of universal supply record, which is what we do at Tealbook. So it's the single source of truth when it comes to that supply data, rather than have it dispersed across a number of different systems, and bringing that bi-directional flow of data that we talked about earlier to make sure that that data is flowing into the right systems and people are able to draw actionable insights from it.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the additional themes that we saw in the research that came up time and time again was the topic of ESG. And so this is something certainly I see more and more. I see it popping up in customer meetings. I see it popping up in board level discussions. And so Nathan, I want to turn this over to you for some read into what the data is showing around ESG.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Well, earlier I kind of teased out a statistic related to this. We mentioned that an inability to assess the diversity of suppliers was a top concern. It was cited by 26% of procurement leaders. And in fact, it was the second most common concern amongst procurement leaders at companies with less than $500 million in annual revenue at 29%, almost a third. But when we asked all procurement leaders about visibility into ESG requirements, the importance of assessing supplier diversity became even clearer. 99% of procurement leaders have an ESG mandate. Now, somewhere there's that 1% that doesn't, but from a research point of view, from a common sense point of view, this is an issue that and a need that impacts everybody. And so, Matt, that despite the importance of these mandates and their ubiquity, nearly 2 in 3 procurement leaders, so about 64%, don't have the supplier information needed to meet these mandates. So you have a situation where everybody has the requirements, but most don't have the required information. And that was really striking to us as we looked through the research.
Well, certainly that is a very large number, especially for such an important board level type of topic that is coming up. And Kate, I'm going to turn it over to you, but I want to introduce the last statistic here, which is that 2 out of 5 said that they have full visibility into their supplier info when it comes to determining compliance around ESG related issues. So how do you take the previous stat that we showed on the previous slide in combination with this? What are you seeing with our customers?
Yeah, and I actually think that's fairly high, considering it's still fairly new. Yes, everyone's talking about it, but it's quite this ESG revolves quite a bit of heavy lifting and developing frameworks and strategies and everything. But it's only going to become more and more important. I think, it not only drives the right behavior, but it also reduces exposure to risks and creates that supply chain agility and resilience that we've been talking about. And I think what companies have realized though is that they need to do it in collaboration with their suppliers and partners, and then create those, stable long-term relationships and safeguard their supply of materials and help maintain that competitiveness, but also building, customer confidence while doing so. So look, it's only going to become more and more important. And I think, having good access to supplier data around how they're managing their ESG in relation to your targets is really critical.
And ESG is a really broad topic at the moment. Do you see in the customers that you talk to, customers focusing on one particular area of ESG, or is it something that they are trying to tackle from kind of a broad lens?
Yeah, and it's a great question, because it not only varies from industry to industry, but it also even varies from company to company. And I think, where a lot of companies start is by looking at what are those, material ESG issues, like based on financial impact, what's important to their stakeholders, and also the ability of the company to actually make a difference through their business practices on that. So, for example, in retail, they prioritize issues such as working conditions and diversity and equity and responsible sourcing. And absolutely, our clients are touching on pockets of those, certainly through their supply diversity initiatives. But we're hearing more and more from customers the desire to find out, about DEI initiatives with suppliers. Do they have a good DEI program? Are they demonstrating that equity? And so I think, you got to choose a place to start. And a lot of our clients probably started with diversity and are growing from there. But there's a number of different, I see different reports, but there's about 16 criteria that you have to hit. And you have to place different importance based on what's most relevant to your company and your industry.
Well, I imagine we're going to be coming back to this topic, because I do see some questions coming in around ESG. So maybe we'll pause there for a second, and we'll actually enter the Q&A portion of the discussion. And I want to remind everybody that's watching to, if you have a question, please go ahead and type it into the box. Those questions are being funneled to me. So I see a couple already, and actually, Nathan, we didn't have one for you last week, and it looks like one of the questions here immediately out of the gate is for you. Were there any other insights from the research that were interesting or shocking?
Happy to talk about that a bit. And I could say that, a lot of the research we've already covered, to me, was surprising. And Kate actually expressed some surprise about some of the stats, and I share that, and that's part of the fun of this. In particular, we're doing research with 50 of the Fortune 100 and companies big and small. And these questions and concerns and vulnerabilities around ESG mandates are prevalent across every type of industry, and something that we're going to continue to look at. So in terms of research that was interesting or shocking, I think we've covered some of it, but there's some things that didn't come up today. One thing I found kind of compelling was, and we explored with procurement leaders whether the supplier data their company relied on during the pandemic to make decisions was inadequate or not. And we found that 41% said it was at least somewhat inadequate. And so, that means amongst that group, more than a quarter, amongst the overall, actually, more than a quarter said it was mostly or completely inadequate. And so that to me was surprising, just in terms of the size of that finding. And also, there was a relationship, or there appears to be a relationship, between the amount of revenue a company has and the incidence of this issue. The less revenue there is, the more common this problem of inadequacy. At companies with annual revenues of less than $500 million, more than 1 in 3 procurement leaders said their data was mostly or completely inadequate, with about 34% said that, compared to 18% of those companies with an annual revenue of $500 million or more. So there's definitely some more nuances to the data, but those are a few things that struck me.
Well, yeah, that's very interesting, and certainly those numbers decreasing the larger the organization is. I don't want to presume, but it's probably due to the increase in investment. So it's interesting to see. Kate,
that's exactly the type of thing that as researchers we would explore further. We would want the opportunity to look more deeply into what's driving that. But I think your hypothesis is probably a good one.
So Kate, I want to get over to you. We do have some questions both around ESG and supplier innovation, so I may hurl a couple at your way here. You alluded to a bit on starting an ESG program, and I think that there are some questions about getting started there. So where do I start when it comes to implementing an ESG program? And I think there's just a lot of confusion out there. So where would you recommend a customer starts?
Yeah, so I touched a little bit on my earlier point about like first determining what are the material ESG issues that are relevant to your company. So that's probably the first place to start. And then, even though it is, rapidly developing ESG strategy and reporting, it is fairly new. So a lot of companies don't actually know how to develop and articulate ESG strategies or how to measure progress and build internal processes and data gathering and all the rest. So, but there are organizations out there that do provide ESG kind of disclosure frameworks and rating schemes. So that's a great place to start. And then companies like Tealbook can provide, some of the data points for each of the existing suppliers, while also helping identify new kind of ESG compliant suppliers. But it's critical, Matt, not to look within the confines of the company, because often the bulk of things like a carbon footprint are actually within your supply chain. So it's crucial to partner with all suppliers so that you can push the ESG agenda out across the entire kind of supply ecosystem. And it's also important, like I've touched on a little bit, to collaborate with suppliers and gather information from them on how they're performing against your standards as well, and building those kind of long-term relationships for them. And like I mentioned, if you don't have a supply diversity program, that's a great place to start. A company like Tealbook can give you immediate visibility into who your small and diverse suppliers are. Like, just give us your vendor master and we'll tell you exactly every, small and diverse supplier within your existing supply base. But then also using a solution like Tealbook to actually discover new suppliers who can help with meeting some of your targets, like emissions reductions, technology, of whatever it might be. We've touched on innovation, but that ties into ESG. Is how do you find those innovative suppliers who help with your ESG efforts?
Well, you took a little bit of the next question I was going to ask you, so maybe we'll stay on that topic. But what are some ways Tealbook has been used to drive supplier innovation?
Yeah, so it's twofold. It's using Tealbook to find those kind of disruptive and innovative suppliers with the product or technology or process areas that they're looking to innovate in, and that can be both within their existing pool of suppliers or within like new suppliers. But as well as promoting those, they then promote those innovative suppliers internally and put them in the hands of those who need them. So it's that real collaboration. We're seeing that more and more within supply chain procurement. It's not a hammering the supply down, it's working collaboratively with them to build those relationships. And through that, and through investing in them, and maybe some of the smaller companies, it's that co-creation of ideas and innovation. We've actually done that at Tealbook with our self-certification offering, working with some of our larger pharmaceutical clients, and the results have been astonishing.
Well, that's fascinating, and actually, this goes a little bit into the next question. Maybe we'll take it away from innovation, because I bet we could talk about it for the rest of the session here. But how can Tealbook help organizations not fall behind the competition?
So we've touched on speed to market, but it's worth repeating that point. So, putting supply information in the hands of those who need it when they need it. So make sure that you kind of have that speed to market. You're working with existing vendors before adding new vendors on. You help that innovation, helps drive that competitiveness, but also finding alternate suppliers or new suppliers for business critical areas within your supply chain as well. So we have, a lot more companies and customers are building these business continuity plans or contingency plans, and they are using Tealbook to find alternate suppliers in other geographies or nearshoring and bringing some of that supply locally, and finding how to shift that supply and reshore it. So that also helps them not fall behind the competition. And then, like I touched on right at the beginning of the talk, even just having a supply diversity program increases your competitiveness. It makes you, from a supply perspective, it makes you more attractive to customers, especially those with kind of stringent diversity targets. It increases your, odds of actually being discovered by them. And it also helps align your diversity agenda to theirs, and better positions you then as a kind of trusted and strategic partner to them.
So we have one last question here, and so I think we can ask this and then end. Kate, again, it's for you. So unorganized data continues to be the biggest problem at my organization, and our tools require a lot of manual entry. Where would be the first place you would start trying to fix your supplier data?
Am I allowed to answer Tealbook? No, jokes aside, I'll talk about kind of how I would approach it without a solution like Tealbook. But in all seriousness, something like a Tealbook, I've been wanting my entire procurement career. We really do make supplier data easy. But if you want to go the hard route, I talked earlier about supplier data residing in a number of different systems. And I think the first thing is just I always like to do a diagnostic of kind of what is the lay of the land. What are the systems that could potentially have supply data in them? Where's that data residing? What data is it? Trying to amalgamate all that data into kind of even a list of, do you know your actual supply base? Often, companies think that they're working with 30,000 suppliers, but you go through the kind of cleansing, harmonizing, and enrichment process in Tealbook, and it transpires you've actually only got 22,000 through all the deduplication. So knowing your actual supply count helps then with, organizing that, because then you've got fewer suppliers to actually enrich the data around. So it costs less. Coming back to that $2,400, you're now doing that on a smaller finite base rather than this larger base of suppliers. But really, in all seriousness, I've done so many recategorization of exercises of suppliers while I've been in procurement, or for updating contact email addresses. It's just, it's in people's email addresses, it's on some of the systems, it's so disparate. And having that all, there's so much power in having a universal supplier record with all that information pertaining to that supplier in one place. And I can't stress that enough. But also just wanted to say that doing that exercise manually not only costs a lot, but also exposes you to risk, because data is changing on an almost daily basis. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Well, Kate, thank you very much for your thorough answers. And Nathan, thanks for joining us again today. It was really interesting getting a deep dive into the research itself. I want to remind everyone that we have one more session in the Wakefield Research webinar. It will happen next week on April 21st, and we will be joined by Jason Bush from Spend Matters. So make sure you mark that, and we hope to see everybody next week.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.